Chapter 5, Linguistic Intelligence. In the early 1940s, Keith Douglas, a young British poet, initiated a correspondence with T.S. Eliot, already the doyen of poets in England. Eliot's responses, invariably helpful, are revealing about the considerations at the level of the word that enter into the penning and the subsequent revision of a line of poetry. Warning against the use of ineffective adjectives, Eliot criticizes the phrase impermanent building. This impermanence should have been clearly established earlier in the poem. After the young poet compares himself to a pillar in a glass house, Eliot asks, "Do you mean that you are also glass?" Referring to a subsequent comparison of the poet to a mouse, Eliot again detects the apparent inconsistency. "I don't think you should be a pillar and like a mouse in the same stanza." Of the poem as a whole, Eliot offers a more general critique. "I am not sure that its myth is wholly consistent. For instance, toward the end you spoke of exorcising the dead lady in the upper room. One does speak of exorcising ghosts from material houses, but in this case the lady to be exorcised seems to be very much more substantial than the house in which you have set her. That is what I mean by consistent." In offering such suggestions, Eliot was merely making public some of the processes through which a poet may pass each time he writes a poem. We learn from Eliot's own notes of the care he took and the frequent agony he underwent in selecting the correct word. For example, in the four quartets, he tried out the phrases "at dawn," "the first faint light," "after lantern and," "lantern out," "lantern down," "lantern time," "the antelucan dusk," "the antelucan hour," and "antelucan dark," before accepting a friend's suggestion of "waning dusk." Many of Eliot's contemporaries in this most introspective century have related similarly fine weighings of alternative wording. For instance, Robert Graves reviewed his efforts to find a substitute for the word pattern in the phrase "and fix my mind in a close pattern of doubt." He considered frame of doubt too formal and net too negative a connotation before alighting after a trip to the sea on the phrase "and fix my mind in a close call of doubt." Upon consulting the Oxford English Dictionary, Graves found that call bore all the senses he needed: a new cap confirming the glory of a woman, a gossamer web spun by spiders, and a smooth cap-like membrane in which a lucky child is sometimes born. Juxtaposed with close, call also furnished pleasing alliteration. Along similar lines, Stephen Spender recounts how he built a poem upon one of his notebook jottings. "There are some days when the sea lies like a harp stretched flat beneath the cliffs. The waves like wires burn with the sun's copper glow." He attempted at least 20 versions of these lines in an effort to clarify this scene, to bring out its musical feeling, to realize his inner image of the brief life of earth and the death of the sea. Among the efforts were these: "The waves are wires burning as with the secret songs of fires. The day burns in the trembling wires. With a vast music golden in the eyes, the day glows on its trembling wires, singing a golden music in the eyes. The day glows on its burning wires like waves of music golden to the eyes. Afternoon burns upon the wires, lines of music dazzling the eyes. Afternoon gilds its tingling wires to a visual silent music of the eyes." Each of these stabs presented problems. For instance, in the first, the direct statement, "waves are wires," creates an image that is not quite fitting because it is overstated. In Spender's view, the poet must avoid stating his vision too overtly. In the sixth attempt, visual silent music of the eyes mixes too many figures of speech in a phrase that is itself somewhat awkward. Spender's final version places the images within an appropriately expansive context. "There are some days the happy ocean lies like an unfingered harp below the land. Afternoon gilds all the silent wires into a burning music of the eyes." While the overall effect, with its intimation of Homer and of Blake, is perhaps not as strikingly original as that wrought by some of their earlier attempts, the final version does capture with fidelity and clarity Spender's underlying impulse, his initial vision. In the poet's struggles over the wording of a line or a stanza, one sees at work some central aspects of linguistic intelligence. The poet must be superlatively sensitive to the shades of meanings of a word. Indeed, rather than shaving off connotations, he must try to preserve as many of the sought-after meanings as possible. This is why Call was the most desirable of the choices considered by Graves. Moreover, the meanings of the words cannot be considered in isolation. Because every word assesses its own penumbras of meaning, the poet must make sure that the senses of a word in one line of the poem do not clash with those aroused by the occurrence of a second word in another line. This is why Eliot warns against the co-occurrence of pillar and mouse in the same stanza, and challenges the exercising of a lady rather than a ghostly house. Finally, the words must capture as faithfully as possible the emotions or images that have animated the initial desire to compose. Spender's alternative verses may be striking or pleasurable, but if they do not convey the vision that he initially had, they fail as poetry. Or, to put it another way, they can become the basis of a new poem, one that the poet had not initially intended to write. In discussing the meanings or connotations of words, we find ourselves in the area of semantics, that examination of meaning that is universally considered central to language. Eliot once observed that the logic of the poet is as severe, though differently placed, as the logic of a scientist. He also noted that the arrangement of imagery requires just as much fundamental brain work as the arrangement of an argument. Where the scientist's logic requires sensitivity to the implications of one proposition or law for another, the poet's logic centers around a sensitivity to shadings of meaning and what they imply or preclude for neighboring words. Even as one could not hope to be a scientist without appreciating the laws of logical deduction, one cannot aspire to be a poet without sensitivity to the interaction among linguistic connotations. But other domains of language, as laid out by linguists, are also of singular importance for the aspiring poet. The poet must have keen sensitivity to phonology, the sounds of words and their musical interactions upon one another. The central metrical aspects of poetry clearly depend upon this auditory sensitivity, and poets have often noted their reliance on oral properties. W. H. Auden declared, "I like hanging around words, listening to what they say." Herbert Read, another poet of the Eliot generation, indicates that, in the degree that they are poetic, words are automatic associations of an oral rather than a visual nature. And Graves's close call had to work as sound just as much as it had to work semantically. A mastery of syntax, the rules governing ordering of words and their inflections, is another sine qua non of poetry. The poet must understand intuitively the rules of constructing phrases as well as the occasions on which it is permissible to flaunt syntax, to juxtapose words that, according to ordinary grammatical principles, should not occur together. And finally, the poet must appreciate the pragmatic functions, the uses to which language can be put. He must be aware of the different poetic speech acts, ranging from the lyric of love to the epic of description, from the directness of an order to the subtleties of a plea. Because this mastery of language is so central, so defining of the poet's calling, it is the love of language and the eagerness to explore its every vein that most clearly mark the young poet. Fascination with language, technical facility with words rather than the desire to express ideas, are hallmarks of the future poet. Though it is probably not a strict requirement, the ability readily to pick up and remember phrases, especially those favored by other poets, is an invaluable stock in trade for the poet. The critic Helen Vendler recalls sitting in on the poetry writing classes of Robert Lowell, where this leading American poet effortlessly recalled the verses of the great poets of the past, occasionally and always intentionally improving a line that he felt inadequate. Beholding this linguistic facility, Vendler remarks, made one feel like a rather backward evolutionary form confronted by an unknown but superior species. This species, the poet, possesses a relation to words beyond our ordinary powers, a repository, as it were, of all the uses to which particular words have been put in previous poems. That knowledge of the history of language use prepares, or frees, the poet to attempt certain combinations of his own as he constructs an original poem. It is through such fresh combinations of words, as Northrop Frye insists, that we have our only way of creating new worlds. In the poet, then, one sees at work with special clarity the core operations of language. A sensitivity to the meaning of words, whereby an individual appreciates the subtle shades of difference between spilling ink intentionally, deliberately, or on purpose. A sensitivity to the order among words, the capacity to follow rules of grammar and, on carefully selected occasions, to violate them. At a somewhat more sensory level, a sensitivity to the sounds, rhythms, inflections, and meters of words, that ability which can make even poetry in a foreign tongue beautiful to hear. And a sensitivity to the different functions of language, its potential to excite, convince, stimulate, convey information, or simply to please. But most of us are not poets, not even of amateur standing, and still we possess these sensitivities in significant degrees. Indeed, one could not appreciate poetry without at least a tacit command of these aspects of language. Moreover, one could not hope to proceed with any efficacy in the world without considerable command of the linguistic tetrad of phonology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Linguistic competence is, in fact, the intelligence, the intellectual competence, that seems most widely and most democratically shared across the human species. Whereas the musician or the visual artist, not to mention the mathematician or the gymnast, exhibit abilities that seem remote from and even mysterious to the average person. The poet seems simply to have developed to a superlatively keen degree capacities that all normal, and perhaps even many subnormal, individuals have within their grasp. Thus, the poet can serve as a reliable guide or as an apt introduction to the domain of linguistic intelligence. But for those among us who are not practicing poets, what are some of the other major uses to which language can be put? Of numerous candidates, I would single out four aspects of linguistic knowledge that have proved of striking importance in human society. First of all, there is the rhetorical aspect of language, the ability to use language to convince other individuals of a course of action. This is the ability that political leaders and legal experts have developed to the highest degree, but that every 3-year-old desirous of a second helping of cake has already begun to cultivate. Second, there is the mnemonic potential of language, the capacity to use this tool to help one remember information, ranging from lists of possessions to rules of a game, from directions for finding one's way to procedures for operating a new machine. A third aspect of language is its role in explanation. Much of teaching and learning occurs through language, at one time principally through oral instructions, employing verse, collections of adages, or simple explanations, and now increasingly through the word in its written form. A compelling example of this aspect can be found in the sciences. Despite the evident importance of logical mathematical reasoning and symbol systems, language remains the optimal means for conveying the basic concepts in textbooks. In addition, language supplies the metaphors that are crucial for launching and for explaining a new scientific development. Finally, there is the potential of language to explain its own activities, the ability to use language to reflect upon language, to engage in metalinguistic analysis. We can see intimations of this capacity in the youngest child who says, "Did you mean X or Y?" thereby directing his addressor to reflect upon a prior use of language. Far more striking instances of metalinguistic sophistication have emerged in our own century. In fact, in the past 30 years. Thanks to the revolution in the study of language sparked by the linguist Noam Chomsky, we have gained a firmer understanding of what language is and how it works, as well as some bold hypotheses about the place of language in the sphere of human activities. While a concern with this form of propositional knowledge, know that about language, seems more prevalent in our culture than in many others, interest in language as a system is by no means restricted to Western or other scientifically oriented cultures. To convey the flavor of these different faces of language is the chief burden of this chapter. We turn our attention first to language because it is a preeminent instance of human intelligence. It also has been the most thoroughly studied intelligence. And so we find ourselves on relatively firmer ground in reviewing the development of linguistic intelligence and in discoursing on the breakdown, under conditions of brain damage, of linguistic capacities. Relevant information has also been secured on the evolutionary course of human language, its cross-cultural manifestations, and its relation to the other human intelligences. Accordingly, in reviewing the current knowledge base about linguistic intelligence, I seek not only to summarize the state of the art in this particular sphere of human competence, but also to suggest the kinds of analysis that I hope will be available in the future for each of the remaining intelligences. The roots of spoken language can be found in the child's babbling during the opening months of life. Indeed, even deaf youngsters begin to babble early in life. And during the first months, all infants will issue those sounds found in linguistic stocks remote from their home tongue. But by the beginning of the second year, linguistic activity is different. It involves, in English-speaking lands, the punctate utterance of single words. Mommy, doggy, cookie, and before long, the concatenation of pairs of words into meaningful phrases. Eat cookie, bye-bye mommy, baby cry. Let another year pass, and the 3-year-old is uttering strings of considerably greater complexity, including questions, when I get up, negations, I no want to go to sleep, and sentences with clauses, have milk before lunch, please? And by the age of 4 or 5, the child has corrected the minor syntactic infelicities in these sentences and can speak with considerable fluency in ways that closely approximate adult syntax. Moreover, sweetening this list of accomplishments, children at these tender ages transcend mundane expression. Average 4-year-olds are able to come up with appealing figures of speech, e.g., comparing a foot falling asleep to bubbling ginger ale. Tell short stories about their own adventures and those of characters whom they have invented. Alter their speech register depending upon whether they are addressing adults, peers, or toddlers younger than themselves. And even engage in simple metalinguistic banter. What does X mean? Should I say X or Y? Why didn't you say X when you mentioned Y? In short, the skills of the 4 or 5-year-old put to shame any computer program for language. Not even the most skilled linguist in the world have been able to write the rules that account for the form and the meanings of the utterances of childhood. This much on linguistic development is fact, not disputed, so far as I am aware, by any scholar. Somewhat more controversial, but rather widely accepted, is the claim that linguistic mastery involves special processes of acquisition, ones apart from those entailed in other intellectual spheres. The most vigorous and most persuasive spokesman for this proposition is Noam Chomsky, who claims that children must be born with considerable innate knowledge about the rules and forms of language, and must possess as part of their birthright specific hypotheses about how to decode and speak their language, or any natural language. Chomsky's claims grow out of the fact that it is difficult to explain how language can be acquired so rapidly and so accurately, despite the impurity of speech samples that the child hears, and at a time when children's other problem-solving skills seem relatively underdeveloped. Other scholars, such as Kenneth Wexler and Peter Kulikover, have made the further claim that children would not be able to learn language at all if they did not make certain initial assumptions about how the code must, and must not, operate, such assumptions presumably being built into the nervous system. All normal children, and a large proportion of retarded ones as well, learn language according to the outlined scheme, usually within a few years. This fact gives comfort to those scholars who want to argue that language is a special process, operating according to its own rules, and at the same time poses difficulties for those scholars who want to argue, as did Piaget, that the acquisition of language simply invokes general psychological processes. It may well be that both sides have a point. The syntactic and phonological processes appear to be special, probably specific to human beings, and unfolding with relatively scant need for support from environmental factors. Other aspects of language, however, such as the semantic and pragmatic domains, may well exploit more general human information processing mechanisms, and are less strictly or exclusively tied to a language organ. In terms of my criteria for an intelligence, we might say that syntax and phonology lie close to the core of linguistic intelligence, while semantics and pragmatics include inputs from other intelligences, such as logical, mathematical, and personal intelligences. Even though the processes described here pertain to all children, there are clearly vast individual differences. These are found in the kinds of words that children first utter. Some children first issue names of things, while other children, avoiding nouns, favor exclamations. The extent to which children slavishly imitate the signals emitted by their elders, Some do, others hardly mimic at all. And not least, the rapidity and skill with which children master the central aspects of language. Young Jean-Paul Sartre was extremely precocious in these regards. The future author was so skilled at mimicking adults, including their style and register of talk, that by age 5 he could enchant audiences with his linguistic fluency. Shortly thereafter he began to write, soon completing whole books. He found his fullest identity in writing, in expressing himself with his pen, entirely apart from whether his words were even read by others. By writing, I was existing. My pen raced away so fast that often my wrist ached. I would throw the filled notebooks on the floor. I would eventually forget about them. They would disappear. I wrote in order to write. I don't regret it. Had I been read, I would have tried to please, as he did in his earlier oral performances. I would have become a wonder again. Being clandestine, I was true at age 9. Here, then, was a child who discovered his considerable powers in the relentless exercising of his linguistic intelligence. By writing a great deal and by realizing himself most fully as a young writer, Sartre was forging the path common to those who end up as authors, be they poets, essayists, or novelists. In this, as in every intellectual realm, practice is the sine qua non of eventual success. Writers speak of their skill as a muscle that demands daily exercise. No day without a line is their byword, just as it was Sartre's. In recollecting their own development, many writers have been able to illuminate the important positive factors as well as the pitfalls that threaten to ensnare the aspiring young writer. Auden argues that in a young writer, promise inheres neither in originality of ideas nor in the power of emotions, but rather in technical skill with language. He draws an instructive analogy to a lad courting. In the first stages of his development, before he had found his distinctive style, the poet is, as it were, engaged to language. And, like any other young man who is courting, it is right and proper that he should play the chivalrous servant, carry parcels, submit to tests and humiliations, wait hours at street corners and defer to his beloved's slightest whims. But once he has proved his love and has been accepted, then it is another matter. Once he is married, he must be master in his own house and be responsible for their relationship. Another crucial early component of mastery, according to Spender, is sheer memory for experiences. Memory exercise in a particular way is the natural gift of poetic genius. The poet, above all else, is a person who never forgets certain sense impressions which he has experienced and which he can relive again and again, as though with all their original freshness. It therefore is not surprising that, although I have no memory for telephone numbers, addresses, faces, and where I have put this morning's correspondence, I have a perfect memory for the sensation of certain experiences which are crystallized for me around certain associations. I could demonstrate this from my own life by the overwhelming nature of associations which, suddenly aroused, have carried me back so completely into the past, particularly into my childhood, that I have lost all sense of the present time and place. The young poet generally begins his self-education by reading other poets and by imitating their voices as best he can. Such an imitation of the form and style of a master is proper, and perhaps even necessary, so long as it does not ultimately stifle the development of one's own poetic voice. But there are numerous signs of poetic immaturity at this time, including an excessive imitation of the model, stating one's emotion, tension, or idea too often or too readily, rigid adherence to a given rhyme scheme or metric pattern, too self-conscious an effort to play with sounds and meanings. An effort to be pretty or aesthetically proper is also suspect. Rather than being presented overtly to the reader, these attributes of beauty and form should emerge from the total experience of reading a work. According to Auden, such an undeveloped poet may reveal himself in at least 3 ways. He may come off as bored, he may be in a hurry and therefore write poetry that is technically slipshod or carelessly expressed. Witness Keith Douglas's youthful verses. Or he may produce work that seems deliberately false or tawdry. In Auden's view, such trash results when a person is trying to achieve through poetry what can be achieved only by personal actions, by study, or by prayer. Adolescents prove particularly guilty of these flaws. If they have talent and have found that poetry can indeed express something. They may fall prey to the mistaken inference that every idea can be expressed through the medium of verse. On the road to poetic maturity, young poets often set for themselves a number of poetic tasks, such as the writing of a poem for an occasion. Fledgling poets can vary the degree of difficulty in assignments. For instance, some assignments are carried out simply to master a certain form. Auden indicates the point and the limitation of such exercises. It would take an immense effort to write half a dozen Rapallic hexameters in English, but it is virtually certain that the result would have no poetic merit. Following such rugged drill, it is often desirable to set oneself a somewhat simpler task. At such times, previously mastered skills can be drawn on automatically, and the words may flow. Thornton Wilder comments, "I believe that the practice of writing consists in more and more relegating all that schematic operation to the subconscious." Walter Jackson Bate records what happened when Keats lowered his ambition temporarily. If he turned temporarily to a less ambitious poem in a different form, the gate would quickly open and he would find himself not only writing with remarkable fluency, but also incorporating with rapid and effortless abundance features of idiom and versification that had been the part of the conception of the earlier, more demanding work. In fact, through practice, the poet ultimately attains such fluency that, like Auden or the possessed poet, Sue Lanier, he may be able to write verse virtually on command, with the same facility as others speak prose. At such time, the danger, paradoxically, becomes excessively ready production, which may keep one mired at the level of superficial glibness rather than ever-increasing profundity. In the end, of course, the writer who would be a poetic master must find the right framework for expressing his words and ideas. As the poet Carl Shapiro once declared, genius in poetry is probably only the intuitive knowledge of form. The dictionary contains all words and a textbook on verse contains all meters, but nothing can tell the poet which words to choose and in what rhythms to let them fall, except his own intuitive knowledge of form. Future writers are those individuals in whom the linguistic intelligence has flowered through work, and, perhaps as well, through the luck of the genetic draw. Other individuals, less happily, may exhibit peculiar difficulties with language. Sometimes the costs are not severe. Albert Einstein is said to have begun to speak very late. But if anything, his initial reticence may have allowed him to view and conceptualize the world in a less conventionalized way. Many children, otherwise normal or close to normal, demonstrate selective difficulties in the learning of language. Sometimes the difficulty seems to inhere chiefly in auditory discrimination. Because these children experience difficulty in decoding a rapid string of phonemes, they not only have problems in comprehension but may also articulate improperly. The ability to process linguistic messages rapidly, a prerequisite for the understanding of normal speech, seems to depend upon an intact left temporal lobe. And so, injuries to, or the abnormal development of, this neural zone generally suffice to produce language impairments. Even as many children exhibit selective difficulties in the phonological aspects of language, one also encounters children impaired in other linguistic components. Some children show insensitivity to syntactic factors. Given sentences to imitate, they are forced to effect simplifications of the following sort. Target sentence, they won't play with me. Impaired imitation, they know not play with me. Target, I can't sing. Imitation, I know can sing. Target, he doesn't have money. Imitation, he no have money. Target, she isn't very old. Imitation, she not very old. It is striking that such children prove quite normal in solving all manner of problems, providing that the oral channels of presentation can be bypassed. In contrast to those children who are relatively normal, except for selective difficulty in language tasks, many otherwise disturbed children exhibit language that has been selectively spared. I have already noted that many retarded children display a surprising ability to master language, particularly its core phonological and syntactic aspects, though they may have relatively little of significance to utter. Even more striking are those rare children who, despite retardation or autism, prove able to read at an astonishingly early age. While reading normally begins at the age of 5 or 6, these hyperlexic children are often able to decode text as early as 2 or 3. In fact, the very children who have little meaningful conversation and are often restricted to echoing will, when they enter a room, seize any reading material and begin to read aloud in a ritualistic fashion. The reading is so compulsive that it is hard to stop. It proceeds by the child's disregarding semantic information, indifferent to whether the materials are drawn from a primer, a technical journal, or a collection of nonsense. At times, hyperlexia occurs with other symptoms of the idiot savant or the autistic child. For example, one hyperlexic child studied by Fritz Dreyfus and Charles Mehigan could immediately tell the day of the week of remote historical dates, while another showed an excellent memory for numbers. In normal right-handed individuals, as I have already noted, language is intimately tied to the operation of certain areas in the left hemisphere of the brain. Accordingly, the question arises about the fate of language in young individuals in whom major areas of the left hemisphere have had to be excised for therapeutic reasons. Generally, if areas as large as an entire hemisphere of the brain are removed during the first year of life, a child will be able to speak quite well. Apparently, early in life, the brain is sufficiently plastic, or equipotential, and language sufficiently important that language will develop in the right hemisphere, even at the cost of compromising those visual and spatial functions that would normally be localized there. It must be pointed out, however, that this assumption of language functions by the right hemisphere is not without costs. Careful examination of such children reveals that they utilize linguistic strategies that are different from those of individuals, normal or abnormal, who employ the normal language areas in the left hemisphere. Specifically, individuals dependent upon the analytic mechanisms of the right hemisphere proceed almost entirely from semantic information. They decode sentences in the light of meanings of the principal lexical items, while proving unable to utilize cues of syntax. Only those children whose language exploits left hemisphere structures prove able to pay attention to syntactic cues such as word order. Thus, both left and right hemidecorticates are able to understand sentences whose meaning can be inferred simply from a knowledge of the meaning of substantives. The cat was struck by the truck. The cheese was eaten by the mouse. But only the individual with an intact left hemisphere can decode sentences where the critical difference in meaning inheres wholly in syntactic cues. The truck was hit by the bus was hit by the truck. It also seems that children without a left hemisphere are inferior to those lacking a right hemisphere in tasks of speech production and vocabulary comprehension, and overall may learn language more slowly. As I observed in Chapter 3, the canalization that governs the process of language acquisition is confirmed by examinations of other unusual populations. Deaf children of hearing parents will, on their own, develop simple gesture languages that exhibit the most pivotal features of natural language. In these spontaneously developing gesture languages, one finds manifestations of the basic syntactic and semantic properties exhibited in the earliest oral utterances of hearing children. From a less happy vantage point, there is the recently documented case of Jeannie, a child who was abused to such an extent during the opening decade of life that she never learned to speak. Freed at last from her cruel imprisonment, Jeannie began to speak during the second decade of her life. She acquired vocabulary quite readily and was able to classify objects properly, but she showed marked and continuing difficulty in using syntax and was reduced to communication primarily through single words. Most tellingly, her linguistic processing seemed to be mediated by the right cerebral hemisphere. In a single case study, one can never be certain of the reasons for a particular pattern of brain lateralization, but it seems reasonable to conjecture that the tendency for lateralization of language to the left hemisphere may weaken with age, possibly because of the passage of a critical period for language acquisition. As a consequence, the individual who must learn language after puberty may be limited to those mechanisms mediated by the right hemisphere. With young children, we confront a system still in the course of development, and as a consequence, a system exhibiting considerable, though by no means total, flexibility in the manner of neural localization and the mode of realization. With age, however, a far greater degree of localization of language function becomes the rule. This trend means, first, that in normal right-handed individuals, specific forms of disability will prove consequent upon specific lesions in critical areas of the left hemisphere. And second, that the possibilities for complete recovery or takeover of these functions by other regions of the brain becomes much slighter. A century of study of the linguistic consequences of unilateral injury to the brain provides powerful lines of evidence in support of the analysis of language functions I have put forth here. Specifically, one can specify lesions that cause particular difficulties in phonological discrimination and production, in the pragmatic uses of speech, and most critically, in the semantic and syntactic aspects of language. Moreover, each of these aspects of language can be destroyed in relative isolation. One can confront individuals whose syntax is impaired but whose pragmatic and semantic systems are relatively preserved, even as one can encounter individuals whose ordinary communicative language is largely vitiated in the face of selective preservation of their syntactic powers. Why this picture of astonishing specificity and localization? Part of the answer lies, no doubt, in the histories and mysteries of the evolution of the language faculty, an issue that has fascinated scholars for many centuries, but whose full lines of explanation remain obscured forever, buried as they are in fossils or prehistory, if not in the Tower of Babel. Some of the mechanisms are shared with other organisms. For example, the detection of phoneme boundaries occurs in similar fashion in other mammals, such as the chinchilla. Other processes, such as syntax, seem clearly restricted to human beings. Some linguistic mechanisms are located in quite punctate regions of the brain. For example, the syntactic process is mediated by the so-called Broca's area. Others are much more widely dispersed in the left hemisphere of the brain. For example, the semantic system. Still others seem crucially dependent upon right hemisphere structures, such as the pragmatic functions of language. What does seem clear, however, is that with age, these functions become increasingly focalized in normal right-handed individuals. The more complex interactions that characterize our daily linguistic intercourse depend upon a seamless flow of information among these crucial linguistic regions. Nowhere is this interaction more telling than in the decoding of written language. It has been established convincingly that written language piggybacks upon oral language, in the sense that it is not possible to continue reading normally if one's oral auditory language areas have been destroyed. This loss of reading skill occurs even in individuals who read fluently without subvocalization or lip movements. Yet, while aphasia almost always entails reading difficulty, the extent of difficulty will depend on the kind of literacy present. What proves instructive are the different ways in which reading may be represented in the nervous system, depending upon the code favored by a particular culture. In the phonologically based systems of the West, reading relies particularly on those areas of the brain that process linguistic sounds. But in those systems, in the Orient, where ideographic reading is preferred, reading is more crucially dependent upon those centers that interpret pictorial materials. This dependence may also obtain for those deaf individuals who have learned to read. Finally, in the case of the Japanese, who have both a syllabary reading system, kana, and an ideographic system, kanji, two mechanisms for reading are housed in the same individual. Thus, one kind of lesion will cause relatively greater injury to the decoding of kana symbols, while another will wreak its havoc particularly on the decoding of kanji symbols. As these mechanisms have become better understood, certain pedagogical implications have followed. We now have insights about how one might go about teaching the reading of various codes to otherwise normal children who, for one or another reason, have difficulty in mastering the prevalent code of their culture. Given that it is possible to learn to read by at least two alternative routes, children with a specific learning disability ought to be able to exploit the other route, and thus to master the principle of written scripts, if not the particular written script that happens to be favored by their culture. And in fact, ideographically based systems have proved effective with children who exhibit particular problems in mastering a phonologically based system of literacy. While evidence from brain damage confers a face validity upon the analysis of the components of language faculty I have proposed, we must still address its implications for the existence of language as a separate, semi-autonomous faculty. In our terms, a separate intelligence. Here the evidence is somewhat less decisive. It seems clear that in the face of a significant aphasia, there may be some impairment of more general intellectual capacities, particularly the ability to form concepts, to classify properly, and to solve abstraction problems, such as those featured in many tests of nonverbal intelligence. In that sense, at least, it is difficult to have a full-fledged compromise of one's language area in the face of otherwise unimpaired comprehension and reasoning skills. Nonetheless, in my view, the preponderance of evidence does support the notion of linguistic intelligence as being an intelligence apart. In fact, it may be the intelligence for which evidence across the full range of criteria sketched in Chapter 4 is most persuasive. For one thing, there are clearly individuals who are highly, even grossly aphasic, who can perform very well within the normal range on cognitive tasks that are not tied specifically to language. Aphasic patients have lost their abilities to be authors. Alas, highly developed skills serve as no guarantor against the ravages of brain disease. And yet severely aphasic patients have retained their abilities to be musicians, visual artists, or engineers. Clearly, this selective sparing of occupational skills would be impossible were language indissolubly melded to other forms of intellect. Thus, in its strictest sense, when one focuses on phonological, syntactic, and certain semantic properties, language emerges as a relatively autonomous intelligence. But once one encompasses broader aspects such as pragmatic functions, the picture of linguistic autonomy becomes less convincing. Indeed, it appears that individuals with a severe aphasia often have a preserved ability to appreciate and carry out various kinds of communicative acts, while individuals with preserved syntactic and semantic capacities may, as a consequence of injury to their non-dominant hemispheres, exhibit gross abnormalities in communicating their intentions and in understanding the intentions and motivations of others. Even as research suggests the separability of pragmatics as a distinct aspect of language, it confirms its neurological dissociation from the hard core of language abilities. Perhaps this state of affairs exists because speech act or communicative act aspects of language are most clearly shared with other primates and, accordingly, least tied to the evolution of a separate language faculty housed in certain regions of the left hemispheres of human beings. By the same token, and perhaps relatedly, sensitivity to narrative, including the ability to communicate what has happened in a series of episodes, seems more closely tied to the pragmatic functions of language, and thus proves more fragile in cases of right hemisphere disease than to the core syntactic, phonological, and semantic functions I have described. As already noted, even a slight aphasia proves sufficient to destroy an individual's literary talent. Yet a study of the way in which language breaks down under conditions of brain damage proves surprisingly suggestive for a student of the literary imagination. It turns out that the linguistic signal can be impoverished in characteristic ways, dependent upon the particular nature of brain injury. In the form of aphasia associated with a Broca's area lesion, the language signal is heavy in substantives and simple propositions while displaying little inflection or modification, a kind of caricature of the style of Ernest Hemingway. In the case of that aphasia associated with a Wernicke's area lesion, the language signal is replete with complex syntactic forms and a variety of inflections, but often the substantive message is difficult to extract, a kind of caricature of the style of William Faulkner. Other linguistic aberrations like idioglossa, where one invents one's own patois and schizophrenic language, are also syntactically wild. Finally, in anomic aphasia, following a lesion in the angular gyrus, the speech signal is devoid of names but filled with things, stuff, kind of, and other circumlocutions. The kind of circumstantial speech frequent in a character out of Damon Runyon, but completely remote from the poet who cherishes le mot juste. It would be ludicrous to trace the sources of these distinctive styles to particular regions of the brain. And yet the fact that brain injury can consign an individual to certain stylistic traits that the creative writer deliberately selects provides a perverse confirmation of the neurological reality of different modes of expression. Until only a few years ago, it was generally believed that the two halves of the brain were anatomically indistinguishable from one another. This fact gave comfort to those who wanted to believe in the non-localization position, with its corollary assumption that the human brain is equipotential for language. Recent findings have not supported this point of view. it has now been amply documented that the two hemispheres are not anatomically identical, and that, in the large majority of individuals, the language areas in the left temporal lobes are larger than the homologous areas in the right temporal lobes. Other important asymmetries between the hemispheres became evident once people started to look for them. Armed with this unexpected information, evolutionarily oriented scholars have begun to investigate cranial endocasts and have demonstrated that such asymmetry, which is not evident in monkeys, can be traced back at least as far as Neanderthal man, 30,000 to 100,000 years ago, and may be present as well in the great apes. It seems reasonable to infer, then, that the intellectual capacities for language go back quite a way before history began to be recorded. Notations have been found from 30,000 years ago suggesting at least the beginnings of writing systems, though the actual invention of a phonetic script goes back only a few thousand years. In defiance of gradual evolution, some eminent scholars, such as the linguist Noam Chomsky and the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, believe that all of language had to be acquired at a single moment in time. To my mind, it seems more likely that human linguistic competence results from a coming together of a number of discrete systems, whose evolutionary history dates back many thousands of years. Quite possibly, various pragmatic features of human language evolved from those emotional expressions and gestural capacities, pointing, beckoning, that we share with apes. There may also be certain formal or structural features that reflect or build upon musical capacities of the sort evinced by far more remote species, such as birds. Such cognitive abilities as classification of objects and the capacity to associate a name or sign with an object also seem of ancient origin. These may facilitate that provocative mastery of language-like systems, recently reported in a number of chimpanzees. Where humans seem unique is in the presence of a supralaryngeal vocal tract that is capable of distinct articulation, and in the evolution of neural mechanisms that make use of the pre-adapted properties of this vocal tract for rapidly induced speech. When sound distinctions can be made and understood rapidly enough, it proves possible to squash individual sounds together into syllable-sized units. The use of speech for rapid communication follows. According to Philip Lieberman, chief proponent of this view of the evolution of language, all of the components for language were present in Neanderthal man, and possibly even in Australopithecus, except for the appropriate vocal tract. It is this latest evolution that has made possible the emergence of rapid linguistic communication with its profound cultural consequences. Once language took off, it exhibited numerous functions. Something of the variety can be seen by considering just a few of the ways in which individuals from diverse cultures have used language, and some of the ways in which cultures have rewarded those individuals who have excelled at such uses. Perhaps most astounding are the abilities displayed by certain bards to sing huge bodies of verse, often nightly to appreciative audiences. As demonstrated by the folklorist Milman Parry and his student A.B. Lord, these singers of tales, these contemporary Homers, can create thousands of verses, in part because they have mastered certain frames, or schemes, into which they can place varying specific contents, and which they have learned to combine in diverse ways to fashion ever-novel epics. The fact that, like all complex human creations, oral verses can be analyzed into component parts should in no way detract from this achievement. First of all, the sheer mnemonic demands for learning these formulas and the rules for their concatenation are formidable. They are in no way inferior to the prowess of the chess master, who knows 50,000 or more basic patterns, or of the mathematician, who can carry in his head hundreds or even thousands of proofs. In each case, these patterns or schemas are sensible, not meaningless, and this meaningfulness certainly aids in recall. And yet the ability to have so many of them at one's cerebral fingertips is no mean accomplishment. Moreover, these abilities may be particularly elaborated in individuals who are illiterate. In this regard, one may note E.F. Dub's recent finding that illiterate Africans were more successful at remembering stories than either schooled Africans or schooled New Yorkers. The ability to retain information like lengthy verbal lists, long a favorite testing area for Western psychologists, is another form of linguistic intelligence that has been especially valued in traditional pre-literate societies. In his book Naven, Gregory Bateson reports that an erudite Yatmal male will know between 10,000 and 20,000 clan names. While techniques are used to recall these names, for example, arrangement in pairs that sound alike, and each name has at least a leaven of meaning, the actual accomplishment remains staggering. We see intimations of this ability in earlier epochs in our own civilization. During classical and medieval times, elaborate systems for aiding memory were devised, including number lists, intricate images, spatial codes, zodiac systems, and astrological schemes. While the person who could remember well was once at a tremendous premium, the advent of literacy and the possibility of writing down information in books available for ready consultation made the possession of a powerful verbal memory less vital. Later, printing rendered this aspect of linguistic intelligence even less valuable. And yet these abilities continue to be cultivated in some circles. K. Anders Ericsson and William Chase have recently demonstrated that memory for a string of digits can be lengthened from the canonical 7 to 80 or even more by a regimen of drill in which the chunks to be recalled become ever larger. After all, we all know it is easier to remember the list. 149210661776200111984. Once it is seen as a collection of memorable dates in the Anglo-American experience. Memory books and mnemonists remain popular. Finally, in a few fields, a keen verbal memory sets one apart. The philosopher Suzanne Langer introspects, "My verbal memory is like flypaper." That is both good and bad, because one's mind becomes filled with irrelevant as well as useful things. For instance, I still remember any number of rhymes from advertisements that I saw in my childhood, and these pop into my head at the most unexpected and ridiculous moments. At the same time, however, I remember reams of the fine poetry that I've read over the years, and that is a delight to recall. Though my verbal memory may be exceptional, my visual memory is unfortunately far from good. A poor visual memory is a particular handicap in handling source materials and research. That's why I have to keep the elaborately cross-indexed system of file cards. The recollection of large amounts of information is a tremendously important gift in pre-literate cultures. Individuals are often singled out because they have this ability, and rites of passage are sometimes so devised as to identify the individuals with this treasured power. Naturally, these powers can be developed and cultivated, but it is obviously a great help if one can remember such lists with seeming effortlessness, as was the case with the mnemonists studied by Alexander Luria and, to a lesser extent, with humanistic scholars like Suzanne Langer. Sometimes this recall ability is valued for its own sake, but oftentimes it is coupled with the ability to relate words to other kinds of symbols, such as numbers or pictures. We encounter here the rise of certain arcane codes, verbal in the first instance, that individuals can use in games requiring high skills. The abilities that allow a Westerner to solve a crossword or an acrostic puzzle may be akin to the abilities, in other cultures, to pun readily or to invent and master nonsensical or recondite languages. Verbal dueling is often valued. For instance, among the Chamula of Chiapas, Mexico, a player will initiate a phrase that has an apparent as well as a hidden meaning, usually sexual. His opponent has to reply with a phrase that features a minimal sound shift from the first and also has a hidden meaning. If he cannot come up with a suitable response, he loses. Oratorical contests in which individuals compete by choosing appropriate items from a traditional repertoire of sayings or songs has been described for a number of societies. In a way that would have delighted William James, who was always searching for a moral equivalent to war, competitive speech-making has replaced warfare among the Maori as a way of demonstrating the superiority of one's group. And as if to underscore the importance of ways of speaking, Tzeltal, a Mayan language, features over 400 terms referring to language use. Over and above these relatively casual uses of language, the peaks of political power have often been reserved for those individuals who exhibit unusual rhetorical powers. It is surely no accident that a number of the most outstanding leaders in contemporary Africa and Asia have been individuals who have won wide acclaim in rhetoric and whose poetry is often recited. Such poetry, like proverbs, has often been used as a memorable way to disseminate crucial information. Rhetorical finesse is part of the upbringing of aristocrats in a traditional caste-like system, even as it may prove to be a significant survival skill among lower echelons of a society. A traditional source of prestige among elder males is their knowledge of the meanings of proverbs and traditional phrases that may still be opaque to less venerable members of the society. Indeed, among the Pele of Liberia, there is a patois deep Pele, a complex language replete with proverbs which may defy interpretation by the younger members of the culture. Furthermore, in a number of traditional societies, the ability to wax eloquent about one's own case often provides a decisive edge in court speech. Among the Chidi of Botswana, the effective power of a chief is determined by his performances in public debates, which are carefully analyzed afterward by members of the group. We can see manifestations of these values in certain pockets of our own civilization. For example, among public school graduates in England, or among individuals from the southern regions of the United States, where training in political rhetoric is still valued in childhood, and where well-honed skills are displayed up to old age. And in fact, the roots of this esteem can be traced back within our own society to Greek times, where political power was regularly held by those individuals who had superior linguistic skills. According to Eric Havelock, who studied the oral culture of that time, within limits, the community's leadership lay with those who had a superior ear and rhythmic aptitude, which would be demonstrable in epic hexameter. It would also, however, show itself in the ability to compose remetae, effective sayings which used other devices besides the metrical, such as assonance and parallelism. Again, the good performer at a banquet would be estimated not exclusively as an entertainer, but as a natural leader of man. The effective judge or even general tended to be the man with the superior oral memory. The general effect was to put a great premium upon the intelligence in Greek social transactions, and to identify intelligence with power. By intelligence, we specially mean a superior memory and a superior sense of verbal rhythm. It would be a mistake to designate our society as one in which the powers of language have been gradually downplayed. Witness the political effectiveness of skilled speakers like Franklin Roosevelt, John Kennedy, or more recently, Ronald Reagan. Yet, on a comparative basis, it does seem that language is less highly valued in our society. Logical mathematical forms of intelligence, of relatively little moment elsewhere, are certainly as esteemed as language. Also, while the emphasis in traditional culture still falls very much on oral language, rhetoric, and wordplay, our culture places relatively greater emphasis on the written word, on securing information from reading, and on expressing oneself properly through the written word. While oral and written forms of language doubtless draw on some of the same capacities, specific additional skills are needed to express oneself appropriately in writing. The individual must learn to supply that context that in spoken communication is evident from non-linguistic sources, like gestures, tone of voice, and the surrounding situations. One must be able to indicate through words alone just what point one wishes to make. These challenges often elude individuals when they are first attempting to write. As an individual becomes more skilled in one means of expression, it may well become more difficult for him to excel in the other. Although there are always impressive exceptions like Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle, the construction of a lengthy work, a novel, a history, a textbook, poses organizational challenges that are different from those entailed in shorter linguistic entities, like a letter or poem, and in spoken performances, be they brief speeches, lengthy orations, or recitations of oral verse. Whereas the emphasis in a poem falls on the choice of every word and on the delivery, within a relatively compact set of lines of one or a small number of messages, the emphasis in a novel necessarily falls on the conveying of a larger collection of ideas and themes, which may bear a complex relationship to one another. Choice of word remains important, to be sure, but proves less at a premium than the successful communication of a set of ideas, themes, moods, or scenes. Of course, some novelists like Joyce, Nabokov, or Updike exhibit the poet's obsession with lexical choice, while others like Balzac or Dostoevsky are far more immersed in themes and ideas. For the most part, I have focused on those domains of expertise in which language itself is at the fore. Whether it be the penning of a poem or the winning of a verbal joust, the precise choice of words proves important, if not all important. But in most societies, for most of the time, and most strikingly in a complex society such as ours, language is as often as not a tool, a means for accomplishing one's business, rather than the central focus of attention. A few examples. Scientists certainly rely on language for communicating their findings to others. Moreover, as I have noted, breakthroughs in science are often presented in terms of revealing figures of speech or through well-organized essays. Still, the focus here falls not on the language per se, but rather on the communication of ideas that could certainly have been conveyed in other words. No need to endure spender-like agonies, and ultimately may be quite adequately expressed in pictures, diagrams, equations, or other symbols. Freud may have initially required the metaphor of a willful rider upon a horse in order to convey the relationship between the ego and the id. Darwin may have been helped by the metaphor of a race for survival, but ultimately their conceptions can be appreciated by individuals who have never read a word by these scholars and have never even been exposed to the original verbal formulation of the concepts. At first glance, other scholars, such as historians or literary critics, may seem far more dependent upon language, not only as a source of what they study, but also as a means for conveying their conclusions. And as a practical matter, scholars in the humanities do attend much more closely to words in the texts they study, in the writings of their colleagues and in their own manuscripts. Yet even here the use of language is best viewed as a vital, perhaps irreplaceable means, but still not the essence of the work being accomplished. The goal of the scholar is to describe with accuracy a problem or a situation that he has elected to study and to convince others that his vision, his interpretation of the situation, is appropriate and accurate. The humanist is tied closely to evidence. Facts, records, artifacts, findings of predecessors, and if his case strays too far from what has been proposed by others, he may well not be taken seriously. But the particular format of his final product is not fixed, and once his viewpoint or conclusion has been gotten across, the particular lexical choices made by the scholar recede in importance, leaving the message to speak for itself. We cannot brook any substitute for the verses of T.S. Eliot, but we can readily enough assimilate the points of his criticism without reading his essays, though in the case of Eliot, much of the power of what he says does inhere in his unusually felicitous phrasing. Finally, the expressive writer, the novelist, the essayist. Surely here the particular choice of words is of crucial importance, and we would not readily accept a trot for the writings of Tolstoy or Flaubert, Emerson, or Montaigne. Yet the purpose does seem to be different, or at least different in emphasis, from that of the poet. For what the writer of fiction wants most critically, as Henry James once put it, is to wrest the essence, the real truth, the fatal futility of fact, from clumsy life. The narrative writer witnesses or envisions an experience or a set of experiences, an emotion or a set of emotions, and his goal is to convey these to the reader as completely and effectively as possible. Once this has been conveyed, the actual words used become less important, though surely they remain a significant proportion of the pleasure of the message, of language calling attention to itself. Whereas the meaning of the poem continues to inhere in its words, the meaning of a novel is much less tied to these words. That translation that is virtually impossible to carry out faithfully for poems is done without excessive difficulty for most novels, though not for all, and with greatest difficulty for those written by poets. While language can be conveyed through gesture and through writing, it remains at its core a product of the vocal tract and a message to the human ear. Understanding of the evolution of human language and its current representation in the human brain is likely to fall wide of the mark if it minimizes the integral tie between human language and the auditory oral tract. At the same time, a student of language who focuses only upon this anatomical arrangement may miss the amazing flexibility of language, the variety of ways in which humans, skilled as well as impaired, have exploited their linguistic heritage for communicative and expressive purposes. My belief in the centrality of the auditory and oral elements in language has motivated my focus upon the poet as the user of language par excellence, and my citation of the evidence from aphasia as a strong argument in favor of the autonomy of language. To the extent that language were to be considered a visual medium, it would flow much more directly into spatial forms of intelligence. That this is not the case is underscored by the fact that reading is invariably disturbed by injury to the language system. While amazingly, this linguistic decoding capacity proves robust despite massive injury to the visual spatial centers of the brain. And yet, I have taken care not to term this capacity as an auditory oral form of intelligence. There are two reasons. First of all, the fact that deaf individuals can acquire natural language and can also devise or master gestural systems serves as decisive proof that linguistic intelligence is not simply a form of auditory intelligence. Second, there's another form of intelligence with a history of equal longevity and an autonomy of equal persuasiveness, which is also tied to the auditory oral tract. I refer, of course, to the musical intelligence, the abilities of individuals to discern meaning and importance in sets of pitches rhythmically arranged, and also to produce such metrically arranged pitch sequences as a means of communicating with other individuals. These capacities also rely heavily on auditory oral abilities. Indeed, they prove even less susceptible to visual translation than does language. And yet, counter to intuition, musical abilities are mediated by separate parts of the nervous system and consist of separate sets of competence. Buried far back in evolution, music and language may have arisen from a common expressive medium. But whether that speculation has any merit, it seems clear that they have taken separate courses over many thousands of years and are now harnessed to different purposes. What they share is an existence that is not closely tied to the world of physical objects, in contrast to spatial and logical mathematical forms of intelligence, and an essence that is equally remote from the world of other persons, as manifest in various forms of personal intelligence. And so, in taking the measure of another autonomous intellectual competence, I turn to the nature and operation of musical intelligence. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find Gardner's book summary and many other fundamental persuasion books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychologic and marketing content. See you in the next one.